So I recently visited Alberta and I did something that I have never done on any of my previous trips to this flat, dry province. I visited a museum. And not just any museum, but the Royal Alberta Museum, or the RAM for short. In Canada, we do not have just one national museum, but rather we have several. And because this country is so goddamn big, each of our 13 provinces and territories has its own provincial or territorial museum, with exception to Prince Edward Island for some reason. Most of them are encyclopedic in nature, which means that they cover a wide variety of topics, and I believe that most of them have kind of divided themselves into two sections, with one section being dedicated to natural history and the other section being dedicated to human history. The Royal Alberta Museum was set up in this way, with one section being dedicated to the human history, the political history of Alberta, and another section being dedicated to its physical, environmental history, which was really cool. It should also be noted that this version of the RAM actually only opened in 2019. It closed in 2015 and moved, and in the process, they decolonized themselves or made efforts to decolonize themselves. So I was really curious to see a museum on the other side of this process and to see how they incorporated Indigenous voices and stories into their displays. I have a few thoughts about this and how successful they were, but I'll come back to that in a few moments. So I went through the Human History Hall first, and right off the bat it started with the pre-colonial history of Alberta and the history of the Indigenous peoples who lived there and continue to live there. I don't think I saved a picture of it. Editing Christia will throw up a picture if I manage to find one, but they also had a large welcome sign that was not only in English and French, as most museums in Canada have both of those languages, we are a bilingual country, but they also included a welcome in one of the Indigenous languages, which was pretty cool. My favorite part of the human history section was this little display that was set up to look like an archaeological dig, and as a former archaeologist and someone who entered the museum world via archaeology, I thought that this was a neat little blend of worlds, and it was really neat to see the methodology being discussed, and it discussed a little bit the archaeological work that is ongoing in Alberta and in Canada, which I thought was pretty cool. There was a lot of really interesting displays, but by the end of the human history section, I'll admit I was feeling a little bit of the museum fatigue. There is a lot to look at, and it covers a very broad array of history, but I also really enjoyed the sections about the fight for women's rights and their right to vote, as well as the section on the fight for LGBTQ plus rights and the collection of buttons that went with both of those topics. I thought was pretty cool. My museum fatigue was cured a little bit when we took a short break and moved on to the natural history section. There was a lot to look at on this floor, as it covered the geophysical development of Alberta and also talked a lot about the native flora and fauna of Alberta, which was really awesome. There were lots of taxidermy animals staged in really neat looking habitats and dynamic situations, and I think for kids it would be a really big draw to see some of these animals like bears, moose, hares, lynx, and all sorts of other creatures that are native to Alberta up close and personal. They also had a tank full of live turtles, which I really liked. There was also like an entire section of this hall that was dedicated to gems and geology, but I went straight to the room full of skeletons because I am me. Most of Alberta has phenomenal environmental conditions that are absolutely perfect for the fossilization and preservation of bones and material matter, and as a result, Alberta has a lot of dinosaurs and dinosaur-related sites across the province. So I went to this new-ish museum and I enjoyed myself. It wasn't my favorite museum, but it did remind me a lot of the museum that I grew up with in British Columbia. It's very similar in the fact that it is also a provincial museum and it has the human history section and the natural history section. So it was a little bit nostalgic for me, and it was also interesting to learn about the Alberta specific natural history and human history, and I learned a lot. When I first visited, I was pleasantly surprised to see the positive steps taken towards reconciliation and including the oft neglected stories of First Nations peoples. But I think I have allowed my bar for decolonization to get very low, and I'll explain why. As I was editing this video, I came across a blog post by a Cree woman named Miranda Jimmy titled "Continuing to Ram Colonization Down Our Throats." Miranda is an Edmonton local, and I want to share some of her critiques of the new museum. And if you want to read this blog post, I'll also put it down in the description. Miranda's blog post is set up in a sort of list, so we'll kind of go through it that way. But the very first critique on her list is the fact that Indigenous people had no influential voice in the museum's creation or renewal, which kind of took me by surprise because, like, that's like the bare minimum when it comes to decolonization in Canada. But instead, according to Miranda's blog post, Indigenous people were kind of only involved after the major decisions had been made, and it seemed like they were invited to kind of just check a box than to actually have their suggestions or critiques heard. Another item on Miranda's list concerns a small section on residential schools that I was happy to see acknowledged, at least in some form. But Miranda had some great points on how it could have been done better, and while it did the bare minimum and acknowledged the existence of these schools, but this section ultimately failed its role to educate people about these awful institutions and their lasting impacts on Indigenous people today. For example, it is quite tucked away, and Miranda remarks how it almost feels like it's being hidden. But I don't think that was entirely the intent by the museum fabricators and the designers. I think that it was more meant to be like a private, separate area where they could affix a content warning. But it's not very well designed, and it's kind of plopped in the middle of a bunch of unrelated displays in the gallery. The content warning was something else that Miranda commented on, because the content warning is in English and in French, but it's not in any non-colonial languages, like it's not in any of the local Indigenous languages, and it seems kind of inconsiderate to not have a content warning for people who don't speak non-colonial languages, especially considering the nature of the topic. Like I said, I really enjoyed this museum. I had a grand old time with my mom and my aunt, kind of exploring all of the galleries and talking about the displays that we saw. But I am really interested in seeing the trajectory of museums everywhere and watch as they kind of stumble through decolonization. And I'm looking forward to seeing how other places end up on the other side of this process. I hope you enjoyed coming along on this little trip with me, though. I have a lot of fun putting this type of video together, this kind of vlog / commentary track where we can talk about museums in a little bit more detail, because I can go and walk through the galleries and see things with my boots on the ground sort of idea. But I am hoping that I can travel more the next couple months / years, and we can do this more often. And maybe one day I'll do a more in-depth video about museums in Canada specifically, but if you're interested in a bit more broad coverage about museums in general, I do have a museum-specific playlist on my YouTube channel, which I will link in the description. But thanks so much for sticking it out to the end of the video with me. I hope you have a great day and or night, and I'll see you next time.